I already mentioned how in our present-day society, different disciplines have developed their own languages, have developed their own interpretations of words, and how it's become almost impossible to communicate between divergent disciplines or divergent paradigms, even between different cultural spaces. We are often using the same words, but meaning very different things by those words. Take the word state, for example. What you mean by the notion of a state is not obvious. It's not something like a car, where it's obvious that the term is defined in functional regards. It's something that gets you from point A to point B in a very specific kind of way. When we're talking about more abstract concepts, the concepts that mean something to us, we usually misunderstand each other. When a conservative is speaking about the state, they have a very different understanding of what the state is and what its major function should be than when a liberal is speaking about the state. And this general difficulty is something where Integral can help us with, because Integral has been successful in creating something that philosophers have been longing for ever since philosophy exists, which is a universal kind of language. The language that Integral speaks is comprehensible by everyone, independently of their cultural context and independently of the paradigms that they have been socialized into. And the idea how this is possible is that if you focus your attention on specific topics, and if you reflect on them, specifically the topic of consciousness and how experience is related to the external world, how, in other words, you make sense of reality. Once you start raising these kinds of questions, the kind of answers that you will come up with will be, how shall I say, the kind of answers will be limited. They will be very similar across different approaches and across different disciplines that are dealing with the very topic. And the more you're thinking about consciousness itself, the more you will develop a universal ability to understand and to speak. To illustrate this, I think one can use the work of Mark Johnson and George Lakoff. I don't know whether I mentioned them already, but I think they're maybe one of the best introductions to Integral that I know of. What they're basically dealing with is they're studying how thinking works, how you create meaning out of your perceptions, and how thinking is related to the world. And their basic idea is that both has something to contribute. Postmodernism, with its idea of pluralism, that different cultural spaces have their own language and their own localized meanings, that cannot simply be taken and put into different contexts, but context is always very important to meaning. Postmodernism to them has something to contribute, just as the traditional view that there are some kind of universal meanings that you can get across. The traditional view that was very strong in analytic philosophy, for example, or that is still very strong in the sciences. The sciences assume that there can be something like a view from nowhere, that there can be an objective kind of language, a language that is independent of the individual consciousness that is using it. A kind of language that is ideally expressed in mathematical language, for example, a language that everyone can understand independently of their cultural background. And Lakoff and Johnson try to integrate both approaches, and their basic idea of how meaning making works is that we have some very foundational experiences that each and every one of us shares, and based on those experiences, we build more abstract concepts that are individually different and that vary depending on the history of the person that is using the concept, and it also depend and vary on the cultural space in which these concepts are developed. But foundational experiences, they have been calling them primary metaphors. Foundational experiences are something that you immediately get. You don't need further explanation, you just need someone pointing you to a specific kind of experience. And that's all it takes. And if you can't get it, there is no way for anyone else to explain it, to put it in more simple terms for you to understand. This is how understanding works in general. There is a starting point beneath which you can't really go. If someone doesn't get it from this starting point on, there's just no way of explaining something. For example, take the idea of composition. They use this as an example. Mark Johnson has been using this. The idea that, for example, my key is in my hand, and if my hand is also in my pocket, you immediately know that your key also will be in your pocket. It's something that you don't need to learn logic for to really grasp. It's something that you grasp on an embodied level. It's something that children already from a certain age get. And starting with such an experience, you can then build more abstract concepts, like, for example, the concept of composition that we're using in logic and that we're using in mathematics. So that's their basic idea. Their basic idea is that we actually build entirely different worlds out of units of meaning that are very simple and very, very universal. What this approach allows you, what this approach allows for is, on the one hand, the plurality of very different conceptions of the world, but on the other hand, it also allows to explain how it's possible for you to learn those different worldviews. Because everyone, this is a very important point, everyone starts as a blank slate in a sense. Whatever is different, whatever is the end result of socialization, is also had a starting point. In other words, however different you might be, there was a point in time when you weren't different, where you started learning this difference, where you started learning this individualized worldview of yours. And this starting point is the same in each and every one of us. And for them, it's basically our embodied experience of being there. And what integral theory does is it focuses its attention on exactly this if you want, scientific, in the sense of it's something that underlies a more abstract notion of reality. It's pre-scientific in the sense of more foundational level of meaning making. Integral theory is addressing it and trying to flesh out these basic structures that it finds in meaning making. These are the structures of consciousness that Ken has been talking about. So whenever you're talking about experience and approaching it from this structuralist approach, where you're looking for structures of experience, you will fall into a universal kind of language, because the things that you will be talking about will not be cultural specific phenomena, but they will be phenomena that are the presupposition of any kind of cultural phenomenon in the first place. The things that Integral is speaking about, things like, for example, perspectives, are something that any kind of individualized standpoint already assumes to exist, already takes for granted. If you didn't, you couldn't actually make sense, you couldn't actually utter any kind of meaningful statement. And this is the performative contradiction that Ken Wilber has been accusing many different traditions of, which is that in not being aware of what you smuggle into the picture, in not being aware of your own meaning-making process itself, you will produce sentences that in the very act of producing them, the action itself, the doing the sentence, the making the sentence, will contradict its actual content. This is what has been the performative contradiction. It's a performative contradiction and not just a formal contradiction. It's performative because in the very act of being aware and making sense of something, or in the very act of claiming something, you at the very same time are contradicting your own action with the statement itself. And integral theory has a huge potential here, because what it creates on this foundational level is the potential for a universal language that speaks to everyone, that everyone can understand, people from scientific backgrounds just as much as people from the humanities, people who have no scientific background at all, I mean people who have not been in academia, they can all understand, because what we all share is this basic being consciousness, or being there. And that's what integral theory is foundationally about. And whatever particular claims it makes, whatever particular findings it integrates, it always does against the background of this being the foundational question. The foundational question for integral theory has been from the very start, what is consciousness and what are the basic structures of experience, or the basic structures of consciousness? It is not a coincidence that Kant's first book was called The Spectrum of Consciousness. This is a leitmotif that you can find in his entire work, that is going from his first work up until his most recent publications. In every single talk, this has been the leitmotif, the guiding question that has been driving integral theory. It is, if you want, a version of minimally integral. It's something that if you don't take into account, if you don't approach phenomena through this perspective, it simply won't be remotely related to what integral is doing. So even if you're talking about more abstract integral concepts like OCWL and so forth, but not using this kind of principle, trying to find the basic structures of experience, you will very likely end up with something that on the surface seems like an integral theory, but doesn't get the really, really simple stuff right. The really simple stuff that is so obvious that people don't seem even to think it's necessary to even talk about because it's so right in your face. And my issue with this is that I think it's so obvious that maybe we tend to overlook it because it's so obvious, and we tend to get lost in it. That's why I'm talking about these issues, and why I'm actually aiming at a very, very low, if you want, hanging fruit here, with a notion of integral that is a minimal notion of integral, which I think in many cases we don't live up to. And whatever comes next, if we don't do it right on this level, I think we'll be in a way, if you want to use a picture, corrupted. So back to Johnson and Lakoff, what they have been trying to show is that in for example, the book Philosophy in the Flesh, what they've been trying to show is that whatever kind of philosophy you take, they can actually be broken down into more foundational assumptions that they make, and these assumptions are immediately you immediately grasp them. The distinctions that are being made, you immediately grasp on an intuitive level. Even very rigid philosophers, and one could say philosophers who have tried to develop a very technical language, like Immanuel Kant, for example, who were really trying to be as concise as possible in their language use, it turns out they're actually using very metaphorical terms. His entire philosophical system is built on very metaphorical terms that he assumes we just grasp as soon he lays them out in his bigger picture. But they are not technical terms in the sense of something that is objectively definable, or they're not mathematical terms, if you want. They're highly subjective. And you have to be a human being. You have to be a conscious creature to understand what he's talking about. And based on these foundational concepts, like the concept of receptivity or the concept of spontaneity, it's something that we grasp, but we don't really grasp exactly in the way he uses it. But the more we read about his overall picture, the more you get it how he means it. And based on such concepts, he builds an entire philosophical frame. And the idea of, in Mark Johnson and George Lakoff's approach in general, is that this is how mind operates in general, not only in philosophy. Philosophy is one of the most foundational disciplines. It's the discipline that is dealing with really foundational concepts like what do you mean by causality, what do you mean by a unity of something, what do you mean by a thing, what do you mean by knowledge, how is the relationship between knowledge and the world. And this is not only in philosophy so, that we're building on these embodied immediate experiences, but obviously in any kind of ideology, any kind of worldview, in any kind of area, whether it's politics or whatever. George Lakoff, for example, has spent quite a lot of time in fleshing out, for example, how in the sphere of politics we use very different metaphorical assumptions to describe political realities. The political reality of the state, for example. Conservatives tend to describe the state on the line of the strict, I think he called it the strict father figure, or something on these lines. The idea is that they basically see the state as a kind of representative of a strict father figure. In other words, the state is the one who's responsible for justice, the one who can also punish you if you do bad things. While liberals, on the other hand, tend to see the state as the more nurturing element, the responsibility of the state being making it as easy for you as possible to cope with the challenges of life, it being more enabling rather than challenging. So they're using very different metaphors to describe the phenomenon of the state here. And did something that is, according to them, applicable to most abstract disciplines, even to mathematics, where the foundational concepts are grounded on embodied, immediately experienced distinctions that are simply obvious to each and every one of us. And this explains how every one of us can learn mathematics, and not only that, but how every one of us can learn these different paradigms in the first place. How every one of us can become socialized and end up being someone else than he was at the very start. And integral theory, to repeat once again, this is the potential where integral theory can become a universal kind of language, where even if you use different kind of terms, you can basically be talking about the same kind of phenomena because they're so foundational. This is the maps of meaning that Jordan Peterson is talking about. The maps of meaning that Peterson is talking about is the kind of questions, the kind of phenomena that you're talking about when you're not just looking into the world, but when you're looking at your looking, when you're looking at the assumptions that you make when you experience reality. And the kind of answers that you give are the kind of answers that end up being, for example, different maps of meaning, as Peterson has been calling them. And even if people disagree on this kind of level, even if they come up with very different models of how we make sense, they still agree on the foundational question, which is that they still agree that you have to make explicit these assumptions that usually come as a form of metaphysics. Metaphysics in the sense that stuff that that you simply are not aware of, that are not visible to your own perception, but yet you use to simply grasp reality without being aware of actually doing that. You in other words, you're just applying specific mechanisms of explanation without really being aware of how you explain things, what an explanation actually means for you. And raising these foundational questions, what are the basic structures of experience, what are the basic maps of meaning, is again necessary for being minimally integral. Whatever your result will be depends on your own personal approach and on your own personal influences, but that really doesn't seem to matter that much. It doesn't really seem to matter to Wilber himself that much. He recently called Peterson integral, and I think one of the major reasons why is because he's aware of this foundational level. He's aware of the importance of being able to see reality at this, if you want, metaphysical level, in the sense of making explicit metaphysical assumptions. It's something that's also very strong in John Gebser, for example. Even though all these thinkers have very different results, all very different suggestions of how we're making sense, they're aware of the question, and this is a necessary starting point for any kind of integral theory.